Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Better a Witty Fool, a critique of presuppositionalism after the longest hiatus we have had on this channel. It has been over 3 years. Wow. In this video, we're going to be looking at Saul Kripke versus presuppositionalism in honor of our month of Saul Kripke. So, previously on Better a Witty Fool, just in case you haven't been with this channel for 3 years plus, in this series, we take the positions of famous philosophers from antiquity to present day and pit them up against the dialectic argument of presuppositionalism as presented specifically on the website, quote, proofthatgodexists.org. These arguments are not necessarily what that philosopher would claim when faced with presuppositionalism, but rather they are objections to presuppositionalism inspired by the positions of these philosophers. Before getting to Kripke's positions, we will review the road so far. Now, the presuppositionalist argument is a dialectic argument, which means you kind of go back and forth with it. It's a dialogue. And so on the website, they give you a series of choices, and basically, if you pick a choice they don't like, they show you why your argument's wrong and move back. However, what we've been doing is taking each branch of that argument and showing why every single one of their kind of refutations fails. If any single one of these individual objections works, the whole presuppositionalist project falls apart. Let's take a look at the refutations we've seen so far. So, we have, I don't care if absolute truth exists. So they first ask the question, does absolute truth exist? If you say, I don't care, they refuse to have a discussion and redirect you to Disney. However, a good refutation comes from William James, the pragmatist, who says that absolute truth is not the truth we care about, pragmatic truth is. And if you want more on that, check out my video on William James versus presuppositionalism. Then maybe you might answer as the skeptic might, I don't know if absolute truth exists. However, they're going to respond with, is the statement, I don't know if absolute truth exists, true or false? And either answer is going to redirect you to the original question. If you think that the statement is true, then you must believe in absolute truth by their argument. However, if you think it's false, you shouldn't have chosen it. And the refutation, of course, comes from Pyrrho of Elis, who says that it doesn't have to be the case that we either know something to be true or know it to be false. We can not believe it at all. I don't know if there are an odd number of life forms alive right now, nor do I know that there's a case that there are not an odd number of life forms alive right now. So I don't have to know or not know or believe to be true or not believe to be true any individual statement. Absolute truth does not exist, so if you claim that, is the statement absolute truth does not exist, true or false, is the same kind of little turnaround, because if you think that claim is true, then you must believe that absolute truth exists. If you think it's false, then you shouldn't have clicked on it in the first place. But the refutation could come from Thomas Kuhn. Theories can only be true in comparison to a paradigm, so they're relatively true. So absolute truth could not exist, but relative truth instead could. Absolute truth implies that a statement is true regardless of paradigm. The statement absolute truth does not exist is relatively true under Kuhn's paradigm, but not absolutely true. So a statement might be relatively true without being absolutely true. So we can click on this without being self-defeating. For more on Thomas Kuhn and his theories, watch my video on Kuhn versus presuppositionalism. Now, the last bucket, and this is the bucket they want you to go for, is absolute truth exists. Remember, if any of those refutations are convincing to you, their whole argument falls apart, because they need every single one of these steps to work. Now, if you want to claim absolute truth exists, but you still want to break their argument down, the next thing they go to is, I know something to be true and I don't know something to be true. So let's say you said, I don't know something to be true. They're going to use the same little jujitsu turnaround. Is the statement, I don't know anything to be true, true or false? If it's true, well, then you know something to be true. If it's false, then you shouldn't have clicked on it. The refutation could come from Agrippa, or Munchausen. Just because we believe a claim that happens to be true does not imply that we know that claim. You can have true belief that is not justified, and justified is required for knowledge. So we can believe the statement, I do not know anything to be true, and claim that, and that claim can even be true without our knowing that it is true, if it is not justified. The Agrippa's 5 modes show this to be the case. If you want to check that out, watch my video on Agrippa versus presuppositionalism, or the Munchausen's trilemma is another video that gets in that same vein of things that are true belief that aren't justified. Therefore, the statement, I do not know anything to be true, is true belief. So, but not knowledge. Anyway, so that's a refutation. Check out my video on Agrippa versus presuppositionalism for more on that. I know something to be true. So let's say you think that absolute truth exists. You know something to be true. Now we're going to talk about logic. And this is starting to get close to what we're going to cover in this video. So then you're faced with the question, does logic exist or does logic not exist? So let's say you say logic doesn't exist. How did you come to that conclusion? Using logic or using some arbitrary method? Either conclusion is going to return you to the original question. If you use logic, then clearly logic exists. But if you used an arbitrary method, you don't deny the law of the excluded middle, and therefore logic can both exist and not exist. There's a lot of problems here. You could be using a different kind of logic that does include the law of the excluded middle and so on and so forth, but then maybe logic does exist. What we're going to use is Bertrand Russell to solve this problem. So if logic implies that logic is not the case, then logic is not the case. One may coherently deny logic using logic. Watch my video on Bertrand Russell versus presuppositionalism for how you can do that. Therefore, even though Russell himself would not hold this position, using some of his ideas and paradoxes, we can conclude that one might deny logic using logic without reaching a contradiction. And finally, if you say logic exists, you're faced with the choice of logic is universal versus logic is person relative. In a future video, we're going to cover what happens if you click on logic is universal, but for now, we're going to look at how logic can be person relative. So, their refutation of this is going to claim that if logic is person relative, then contradictions are acceptable. Therefore, logic is also universal. I don't think so. We're going to look at a refutation from Saul, Kripke, and Kripke's modal semantics that might have some power here. Basically, logical truths are false in worlds that are not accessible to this one. If there are situations in which logical truths are false, then they are not universal. Therefore, logical truths are not universal. In this video, we're going to explain that argument in a little bit more depth and look briefly into Kripke's modal semantics. But first, who is Saul Kripke? So Kripke is a prodigy logician. He wrote papers which revolutionized logic before graduating high school. He's a master of modal language. He gave lectures on modality and language, which later became Naming and Necessity, one of the most influential works of the 20th century. And he is arguably the greatest living philosopher. Now, simply, Kripke semantics are what we use to give meaning to logical terms like necessary and possible. This is going to be a very oversimplified summary of Kripke semantics. For more on this theory, check out the video, What is Kripke Semantics? Basically, for Kripke, a statement is necessary if and only if it is true in all possible worlds which are accessible to this one. Now, we frequently think of logical truths as true in all possible worlds, and this definition would reinforce that, but it also means that such truths are not true in all worlds, only those worlds which are accessible to this one. And whenever we say a statement about necessity, possibility, we're just talking about those worlds which follow all of the rules that are logically necessary in this world. Okay? So, there are worlds that are not accessible to this one, namely those worlds where the rules of logic do not apply. We might imagine that classical logic is true here and necessary here in the actual world. But it does not seem strange that there might be some world where a non-classical logic is true, and all of those claims are necessary in that world. We just wouldn't be able to access that world, or we wouldn't bear the accessibility relation to that world. Why? Because they have things that are necessarily true there, which are not true here, and vice versa. Since these types of logic are contradictory and necessary in each world, our world and that world are not accessible to each other. So, while logic may be the case in all possible worlds, that does not mean that it is the case in all worlds, just in all worlds accessible to this one, or all worlds that are possible based on the logic that is necessary in this one. This means that logic is person-relative, since someone in this world would have a very different logic which is necessarily true than someone in a world where non-classical logic is true. Those worlds would not be accessible to each other, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't exist in some sense. So, Kripke's objection, remembering that this is not actually what Kripke thinks, but simply an objection inspired by some of his views, logical truths are false in worlds that are not accessible to this one. If there are situations in which logical truths are false, then they are not universal and person-relative, therefore logical truths are not universal. So, we've already done William James versus presuppositionalism, Pyrrho, Thomas Kuhn, Agrippa, Bertrand Russell, and now Saul Kripke. We're going to change up the second half of this series a little bit from what it has been previously. We're going to look at Aristotle versus presuppositionalism, David Lewis versus presuppositionalism, even St. Thomas Aquinas versus presuppositionalism, and finally, I will get in with some of my own objections to presuppositionalism. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay tuned for a special Halloween surprise coming up in just a few days. Stay skeptical, everybody.